Well, for more on this, we're now joined by anti-apartheid activist and the chairperson of the Moral Regeneration Movement, Father Smangaliso Mkhatshwa. Father, thank you very much indeed for joining us. A very good evening to you.
Hello, good evening, and to your audience.
It is a difficult time for South Africans to try and work out how they should remember FW de Klerk. From what you know of him and the history that you've lived through, what ought to be the legacy that we put fairly against him?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Well, first of all, the late the FW de Klerk and I were contemporaries in Parliament, the 1994 first democratic Parliament. So I knew him as a member of Parliament. I knew him also as a deputy president at that time during the unity government situation. And later on, when I was Deputy Minister of Education, I had occasion to meet him also socially. And I even remember one or two specific occasions when he introduced me, even introduced me to his wife, you know, the second wife, and so on. So as a person, I would say, I think he was quite a decent person. But the reality is that he had a history. He had a baggage that he was carrying and which I could not ignore. And the baggage was that one, although one cannot responsibly accuse him of having been responsible and even knowledgeable about specific incidents of torture, of murders, of racial, discriminations and so on and so on. But one can say that he must have been part of the machinery that made the policy, which made it possible then for the operatives and the guys on the ground to take liberties, to murder people, to torture people, to do all kinds of horrible things that I'm sure were exposed at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I also remember very clearly that some of his agents, especially military intelligence and so on, were actually responsible for my own torture. And this, of course, is recorded. It's not just my own feeling and so on. You can go and check your, documents and so on. There was a court case that was involved and they admitted and what have you and so on. So I don't think it would be responsible to assume that he was aware of those individual specific actions of torture, of murders, and so on, but he was part of the machinery that made the policy that was responsible for making it possible for the guys on the ground to carry out those apartheid tortures and incidents. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that I would be the last person to say FW de Klerk was a devil, because first of all, I'm not God to judge that. But secondly, I just think it would be just totally irresponsible and immature to make that kind of statement. What I can confidently say is that FW de Klerk was part of a system of apartheid, was part of a machinery of apartheid that was responsible for all the atrocities and that were exposed at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that would be my first reaction. But also as a human being, as a priest also, I'd also then say, that said, he survived by a family, by his children, by his wife and people dear to him. And obviously they are very sorry about what happened and so on. And as a human being, I would also then say, yes, we would like to offer our condolences and so on. And offering condolences does not mean in any way condoning the evils of apartheid. That was my first reaction.
In reading his eulogy today, President Ramaphosa said that de Klerk, born into white privilege and power, raised in the ideology of racial superiority, committed to the defense of an abhorrent and inhumane system. FW de Klerk, however, would come to play an important role in our democratic transition. Take us through what that meant. Did he play a significant role? Many say that his hand was forced, and so that perhaps the role that's attributed to him is overstated.
Well, that's a very interesting one, because one, the environment in which de Klerk made that statement was of such a nature that, one, internationally, I think the international world had more, at least in very broad terms, had come to the conclusion that apartheid had become a liability. And even those like the Americans and the others, and even in the UK and others who had supported them, they also felt that, perhaps the time was up for apartheid to be exposed for what it was, but also it becomes such a liability that their own interests were no longer being served by an apartheid state and politics. That's the one thing. But the second point was that economically, it had become very clear to de Klerk and also his advisors, especially his intelligence component, that there was no way the economy of South Africa would survive in its prevalence, in the form in which it was, and the support that it had received, especially from the Western countries and so on. And that the time, therefore, had arrived for a new way to be found, which would hopefully bring in a society that was more open, that was more democratic, and although they didn't say that, but a society that was probably pro-West, because there's no way that those countries would have supported a radical change without taking into account their own benefits and interests, in the process. So there was a way in which I think de Klerk and his, especially by his advisors, realized that they were put in a corner. And that although militarily, let's be honest, militarily they could have gone on to fighting, we did not, as even a liberation movement, and as activists were fighting against apartheid, we did not have the capacity to satisfactorily and finally take on that military machine and to have won, prevailed against it. Would have made things very difficult for them, which we actually did. I mean, through your ordinary activities and movements, local government-based movements that we wish upon as the UDF and the civic movement and other, trade unions and so on and so on. We made that government, in fact, destabilized and almost ungovernable. But that was not enough then to bring it down completely. So it needed someone And that's where then I think we cannot take this away from him. Someone like FW de Klerk to say, okay,
Yeah.
guys, we may not say it so openly, we would be too embarrassed to admit that, but the reality is that the game is up.
All right.
And
Father Mkhatshwa?
his very conservative supporters would have wanted to carry on, but he had the guts and the courage to say the time has arrived.
Father Mkhatshwa, let me just ask you to reposition your camera because we can't see your face and we'd love to. There we go.
I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Can you see? It's
Yes.
actually quite handsome face. But,
So, I want us to go back to 1992 because I remember quite well at the time the referendum took place and he tried to get support from the white population to continue with the negotiations with the ANC and this transition to end apartheid. Do you think that maybe his contribution was perhaps to try and get the majority of white South Africans on board and to avert some of what you've described potentially that could have been a lot of bloodshed?
I think de Klerk was sufficiently intelligent to listen also, I think very sensitively, to the advice given to him. I just forget his name, the National Intelligence Agency at the time. Those were very bright and intelligent guys, very well educated. And I do know it's on record that they actually advised him and his supporters, and they also made it very clear. They put the situation as it was then right in front of them, and they said, these are the options that you do have. But you are the political power. You can decide to take this or that. And I think that's where de Klerk then, at least for all his sins, must be given credit for, that he probably must have listened to those guys who said, Tata, the game is up. We cannot continue along these ways. So that would be my reading of that referendum. I think the referendum, in a sense, was just going through the motions. And as we know, at that time, the only people who could have a say in the future of the country were people who were white. And those are the people that he consulted. He didn't consult the black people. And those are the people then who probably, at least at that time, I think they probably were more likely to go along with what the then government proposed or suggested would be the best way forward. And I think that's what happened.
So 1994 came, and there was an opportunity, I think, for everybody to come clean and to confess their sins. The TRC also gave them that vehicle. Do you think that President de Klerk, former President de Klerk, showed enough remorse post-94, and that maybe had he could have been forgiven the sins of apartheid?
My hunch is that he was a prisoner of his past, a prisoner of the ideology that he had been brought up to, to support, but also taking into account, I have nothing against his family, but if you look at the role that some of his parents or grandparents or whatever, that they played in the history of Afrikanerdom and so on, you can also appreciate the fact that there's no way he could have completely extricated himself from being part of that history. But at the same time, that having said though, I still believe he was sufficiently educated, intelligent person, to be able to also realize when the game was up. So it was not out of the greatness of his heart that he then said, guys, let us now change. There were factors, international factors, internal factors, especially the anti-apartheid structures and struggles inside the country, and also those outside the country. I think the accumulation of all those factors must have prevailed on him to say, whatever I might have wanted, whatever my followers may want, if I'm a good leader and I have to think also of their own future, I have very little option but to say, this is the route to take. Not perfect, but pragmatically, this is probably the most intelligent way to go. And I think he has been proved right.
He spent quite a bit of time over the years trying to suggest and say that that he had a change of heart, that he acknowledged that he was right-wing, he was conservative and racist at one point, but that over time that he found a new way of looking things. Do you think that he did? It's a pity that he didn't express it in a way that people perhaps would have been able to embrace it as a genuine transformation and change. But as somebody who knew him, do you think that he genuinely had a change of heart, especially as he got older, especially as South Africa's democracy took root?
I have absolutely no reason to doubt his genuine feelings. But what I regret, though, is that he did not take the opportunity in good time to convince other people that he was a changed person. That's for me, the unfortunate part of it, because I mean, I watched the video where he expressed his regret and everything else and so on. I have no reason to doubt that at all. But I'm just saying it's a great pity. He lost an golden opportunity. Either, if not at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, but even after that, he still had so many years, even using his own foundation to have made that change of heart to have been made known. And if I may also just suggest, I know it's now probably, maybe it's too late for that, but I would have thought myself that if de Klerk and those who supported him really wanted to make a statement of reconciliation, not words, what they probably would have done through his foundation or other, particularly Afrikaner entities and so on that are still very influential and so on, they could have probably set up something like, I don't know, some programs or some initiatives or even a special foundation to help empower the people that were destroyed by apartheid. And one area, I know there are lots of things that probably needed to be fixed, but the one area that I feel very strongly about, even now, after 1994 were blundered, is the area of the education, genuine, empowering education, particularly of the formerly oppressed Black people. And I even remember very well that when these young people, the 1976 generation and so on, when they were fighting for education, it was not just about Afrikaans or English or anything of the sort, maybe in their own confused way. They wanted an education that would empower them intellectually, economically, physically, and otherwise. Now, if you look at the system of education from 1994 up to what it is now, I'm not so sure to what extent, quite frankly, there's been a radical change from that system of education to the one that is truly empowering the millions and millions of young people, young men and women who are striving to ensure that they build a future for themselves and for this country. I'm not so, I may be wrong, but I'm not so sure about that. So for me, I'm therefore suggesting that, not speaking for de Klerk, but I would have suggested that if at all he would have had an opportunity, that's one, just only one area where he could have made a huge contribution. And for me, that would have spoken much more than words of say, I'm sorry, this has happened, and blah, blah, blah. That would have been, in fact, would have immortalized his contribution to the future of this country.